First, I'm going to discuss identity conflict. I'm going to give a brief definition. I'm going to discuss the theory of collective action and how that applies to identity conflict. I'm also going to talk about national and ethnic components of identity conflict. Next, I'm going to discuss Korestalina's 4C model of identity conflict, and I'll explain what that is and what it means. Then I'm going to discuss Cyprus itself, the history of the conflict there, and how Korestalina's 4C model fits it, with some revisions. The next part is going to be about the relationship between nations and land, followed by the relationship between nationalism and land, and what land and symbolism have to do together in terms of identity conflict. The final part of my presentation is going to be the role of land in identity-based conflict resolution strategies. Identity conflict means existential needs, values, safety, dignity, and control over one's destiny that stem from complex psychological, historical, and cultural factors. Denial of these needs is what leads to conflict. This is a very eloquent quote, and basically what it means is identity conflict is when a group's identity is seemingly threatened or jeopardized by an outside force, usually another group's identity or existence, and this leads to conflict. There are several factors that lead to identity conflicts. The first is myths that define who is a group member. These come in the forms of stereotypes, negative perceptions, but they also come in the form of characteristics about who we are and who we're not. For example, Serbs and Croats, they speak the same language, but they have different religions. So based on the differences of religions, who's a Serb and who's a Croat. Another example, back in the colonial era, the French and the Spaniards, same religion, Catholicism, yet different languages. So based on these differences, they determined who was this and who was that. The second factor is that these mythologies give rise to emotionally laden symbols that politicians often use to gain the support and to garner feelings from their followers. Perfect example of this, in 1989, Slobodan Milosevic went to Kosovo Field. Kosovo Field was a location where a very famous battle was held in 1389. On the 600th anniversary in 1989, he paid a visit to this field, which now is the home of a monument about this battle, and gave a very rousing, antagonistic speech, which many experts believe was the very, very beginning of the fall of Yugoslavia, and that led to the war and the ethnic cleansing we saw in the 1990s. So that's a very good example of how he used this symbol, this field, as a way to motivate public support and, bad feelings towards the other side. The third factor is developing an in-group and out-group psychology. This is basically an us versus them mentality. It's our success is their loss, our loss is their success, and it creates this sort of competitive mindset that we cannot exist while they do, and vice versa. The theory of collective action. The basic idea is that groups can attain their goals better when they work together collectively. These goals may include survival, a sense of self-worth, respect, things like that, often political in nature, but not necessarily. On the flip side, in addition to attaining goals working together, it can also work in an opposite way, in that it can motivate people to anger and to violence, sort of in the way the previous slide showed, that our losses are their successes, our successes are their losses. So working together we can accomplish our goal, and also what happens to one of us happens to all of us. It's the group's definition of itself as a group, its conception of its enduring characteristics and basic values, strengths and weaknesses, hopes and fears, its reputation and conditions of existence, its institution and traditions, and its past history, current purposes, and future prospects. National identity, in a very short synopsis, is somebody's relationship to their nation. At some point or another, most individuals will affiliate with a nation, and that becomes their national identity. Ethnic identity is a little harder to define because ethnicity and ethnic identity, it is very constructed, and it is very subjective to the individuals of that group. It follows along lines of behaviors and culture more than biology or any of those traits, so very constructed. And the best way to explain ethnic identity, my graph here shows some research that was done by Korestalina amongst Russians and Tatars. It was between 1998 and 2001 that this research was conducted. It shows she interviewed, I think it was about 500 of each population. And she asked them which of these 4 factors would they rank very important in defining ethnic identity. The numbers correspond to percentages. So for example, for religion, 60% of Tatars said that that was a very important part of defining who they were as an ethnic group, whereas only 8% of Russians felt that way. The first is comparison, a favorable in-group perception. It's comparing them to, it's basically comparing us to them. Again, negative stereotypes, myths, stereotypes in terms of economic value, social value, things like that. It's just a basic, contrast going on there. That leads to competition, which is a basic need for resources and the intersection of different interests among different groups. That leads to confrontation. That is when social identity becomes very, very salient. And that is when it is cemented and becomes very concrete as to who we are, what we represent, what we want, and how we are, most importantly, how we are different from them, and most of the time, how we are better than them. That leads to counteraction, violence, war, genocide, death. That is how it eventually leads to that. Perfect example of this, the Rwandan genocide in the 1990s. The Rwandan genocide, we know the genocide itself and the war was the counteraction component, but none of that was possible without the propaganda and the influence from Burundi and Democratic Republic of the Congo, the outside factors. None of that would have been possible without decades and decades of those kinds of influences and messages coming down to counteraction. In 1960, Cyprus became independent, and in 1974, Turkey invaded Cyprus. There was lots of death and battles. And eventually the UN stepped in and divided the island. It divided the island into 2 parts, the northern part and the southern part. The northern part, as you can probably guess, is the red part. That is where the Turkish Cypriots normally live. It's 97% Turkish Cypriot population there. The southern part is the Greek Cypriot population. The little blue line in the middle, that is the UN green line. That is the DMZ of that island. And the dark blue areas, those are UK naval bases. They're sovereign territory under the United Kingdom. So basically the island is divided into those 2 parts. From 1979 to 1983, there were lots of peace talks, usually brokered by the UN, some Norwegian nations, but they just could not come to a resolution as to how the Greeks and the Turk Cypriots could share power in a joint government. In 1983, this culminated in the Turkish Republic of Northern Cyprus declaring their independence. To date, and that's the red area, to date, Turkey is the only nation that has actually recognized the TRNC as a sovereign nation. The rest of the world recognizes the United Republic of Cyprus, which is the southern part. Right now, Cyprus is the most militarized zone in the world aside from the 2 Koreas. So it might be a little surprising, but it's true. The right to territorial control is what distinguishes nations from other social collectives. There has to be land. By all definitions, there really does have to be land in order for a nation to be a nation. It's very important. The Cyprus case makes this very evident. The Cyprus case, the TRNC recognized this, and that is why they pulled away from Cyprus. This idea of nationalism is different from ideas of patriotism, and that nationalism comes with this mindset of this is our country and we're better than other people, whereas patriotism is this is our country and we're proud of who we are, and it has no bearing on other nations at all. The best example of how nationalism and land intersect is a phenomenon as ethnic separatism. That is basically a fancy word for secession. When ethnic groups secede from an existing nation to form their own collective. Cyprus is by no means the only example of this. We've seen this in Kosovo, we've seen this in Kashmir, we've seen it in African nations, we've seen it everywhere. Land and symbolism. Land is symbolic in several ways. The first way is it has great historical significance, and that basically means that something very important happened here for whatever reason. It can be, yesterday, it could be 1,000 years from now, but land has that historic value and that emotional attachment that goes with it based on previous events. There are also goals such as power, wealth, and meaning that come with land. A good example of this was when President Nasser of Egypt expelled the UN forces from the Sinai Desert, which was part of Egypt at the time, still is. But he expelled the UN forces, which led to the 6-day war between Egypt and Israel. His expulsion of the UN forces was a show of power and a show of strength that Egypt was not going to be run by the UN or any other nation, and that they did have the power to expel them from their land. So this had great meaning and great significance to the Egyptian people and led to greater support for war. Finally, gaining land means something to its citizens. The best example I can give of this is the city of Jerusalem. It's very important, and having it in its possession means something to its citizens in two very important ways. First, it is not able to be replicated. There is only one Jerusalem. There will never be another. There's only one, and you'll never find another one anywhere you go. The second is that Jerusalem can only be inhabited, this is the idea, that Jerusalem can only be inhabited by one group or the other, by Muslims or by Jews, typically. The presence of one or the other in the city contaminates it for the other. So there really can only be one or the other present there. So that is why land is very, very symbolic to